and welcome back to the last part of chapter 5. And here we've been talking about variable versus fixed costs primarily, and how those costs change. Okay, so hey, does the level of production that I have impact the cost I have? And how do I fit this cost equation into something that tells me how I can approximate cost? Whether I want to use, a scatter graph to do that, whether I want to use the high-low method to do that, whether I have the data analysis tool pack in Excel and I want to be a little bit more advanced, we got different options in how we can look at that. Now, the last part of the chapter kind of branches off, and we introduce something that is called contribution margin. So contribution margin, this is extremely important, okay, for just the class in general. Contribution margin equals my sales revenue less my variable cost. And contribution margin really only is looked at for internal purposes. So if you're looking at this screen and you're like, okay, income statement, I'm thinking US GAAP, I'm thinking I'm preparing financial statements. No, I mean, like you are, but you're preparing a different type of financial statement that is only going to be used for internal purposes. So no external user of a financial statement would ever say, well, what's your contribution margin? That's not really a metric that external users are thinking about, but it's definitely something that internal users are looking at. Because my contribution margin income statement, again, internal purposes, is going to allow me to perform what's called what if analysis. So in this case, I'm looking at this income statement and I'm seeing I have 15,000 units that are sold. And here's going to be my net operating income. Now notice how this hopefully looks very different than an income statement you're used to from Principles of Accounting 1. Because here I have my sales revenue less my variable cost equals my contribution margin. Then I subtract out my fixed cost to get my operating income. How does that look different than a traditional income statement, a financial statement income statement? Well, there we typically have sales revenue less cost of goods sold, right? Gives me gross profit, less selling general and administrative expenses gives me my net income, okay? So I hope that you can identify that this is structured a little bit differently, okay? We're still looking at all of these costs, right? Because remember, we categorized everything as variable or fixed. So we're still calculating some level of income, but again, we're doing it understanding how much, right, is based on different cost behavior. Because if I sell 15,000 units, okay, I am going to earn sales revenue of $5 a unit. So 15,000 times 5 gives me 75. But I'm going to spend $1 in variable cost. So 15,000 times $1 is 15,000. To get contribution margin, well, I have $4 per unit, which is $60,000 total. Now I have 40,000 in fixed cost. Is that going to change? When I go perform a what if analysis, is that ever going to change? No, that's always going to stay the same. Because that fixed cost is my rent, my supervisor salary, etc. So if we come over here and we say, well, what about if we sold 16,000 cups of coffee? Well, notice this 14,000 or 40,000, it's equal to what we saw in the last slide. But what is not equal, right? Well, it's my sales revenue and my variable cost. Those two things change depending on the amount of cups of coffee that I sell. So now I have 16,000 times 5 gives me 80 in sales revenue. 16,000 times 1 gives me 16 in variable cost to get a contribution margin of 64,000 bucks, less my fixed cost. So I'm going to look at this. I'm going to say, if I sell 16,000, I'm going to earn 24,000 bucks. Versus if I sell 15,000, I'm going to earn 20,000 bucks. All else held equal, why would I not try to earn an additional $4,000? Right? Well, of course, I'm in the business of making money. That's probably what I'm going to try to do. Okay. So the other thing that we can look at as well is going to be a contribution margin ratio. Okay. So, okay. We'll roll with this. Our contribution margin ratio is going to look at this, and I'm going to divide my unit contribution margin by my sales price. So remember, down here, I have my contribution margin equal to $4, and that's the same regardless, right, of the amount of units that I sold. So I have my $4 divided by my sales revenue of 5, gives me 80%. So in this case, Starbucks manager is saying, I want to spend an additional $3,000 a month for local advertising. I'm going to stop right there and I'm going to say, what kind of cost is that? Well, that's going to be a fixed cost. Okay, so I want to spend an additional extra $3,000 fixed cost a month for local advertising. Hey, I think that if I spend $3,000 in a fixed, I'm going to increase my monthly sales revenue by $5,000. Okay, so now I have to ask myself, I have my fixed cost going up by 3 and my sales revenue going up by 5. Well, how much is my variable cost going up by, right? Because I need to make sure that I can cover the additional $3,000. Because say my variable cost went up by 4,000, well, now I'm going to be losing money if I take care of this. So what I'm going to do here is, since I know my unit contribution margin ratio, well, I'm going to say that a $5,000 increase in my sales revenue, well, how much of that am I going to take home? I'm going to take home 80% of that, right? So I'm going to increase my contribution margin by 4,000. So I have a contribution margin equal to 4,000. Now I have fixed cost of 3,000 that's increasing. So I have an increase in profit of 1,000. So all else held equal, again, why would I not do that? That's going to increase my profit by $1,000. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Okay. So again, you can look at contribution margin ratios. You can look at unit contribution margin. You can look at total contribution margin. They all tell you the same type of information, right? And it's really, how are my costs changing based on different types of, cost behavior. So here's the summary of what we just did. And again, just kind of reiterating that you can use different types of methods within contribution margin to derive different results. Okay, or to just look at things slightly different. You're going to get the same results, but it's just looking at and analyzing things a little bit differently. Okay. So the next thing to talk about, and where we're going to finish this chapter, is the difference between variable, okay, which is like contribution margin, what we were just talking about, and full absorption costing. So full absorption costing is accounting 1310. Okay, so that's my financial statement, external reporting. And here we are classifying things as manufacturing versus non-manufacturing. Cost of goods sold versus SG&A expenses, right? So again, you kind of got to stretch your memory, but you have sales less my cost of goods sold equals gross margin, less my non-manufacturing or my period costs or my SG&A equals net income. Okay. Now compare that to what we're talking about here, where I'm looking at my variable costing, and I'm using that for internal decision making. So I'm not categorizing it as manufacturing versus non-manufacturing, period versus product. I am classifying it as variable versus fixed. So again, I have my sales revenue less my variable cost equals contribution margin, less my fixed cost gives me net operating income. Okay, so we might see a difference here because my net profit is not going to be the same under both methods if I have differences in how much I manufactured, okay, versus how many I sold. How many products did I produce versus how many products did I sell, okay? So again, we're slicing the data a little bit differently, and how we treat it under US GAAP is going to be different than how we look at it under variable costing. And that's totally fine, right? But you got to kind of keep that in mind. So the last thing to think about here is this cost of goods sold. That's going to equal my full manufacturing cost per unit multiplied by my units sold. So what is this going to be? It's going to be DM plus DL plus variable overhead plus fixed overhead per unit. Okay. So because it's cost of goods sold and it hangs out under this full absorption costing, that's why I have variable and fixed. Notice I wouldn't do that under variable costing. I keep those separate. So again, we have to understand, what am I doing for US GAAP versus what am I doing for internal users to make decisions based off of. So we're going to look at reconciling between the methods, and here's the data that we're going to use. So you can see a couple of different things. Number one, the units that I produce is 10,000 versus the units that I sell is 8,000. I'm going to keep that in mind. Okay. And I sell these units for $100 a unit. Now I have manufacturing cost. And here again, this is important. I have my variable, right? My DM, my DL, and my variable overhead. But now I also have this fixed manufacturing overhead as well. Okay. And we're saying I have fixed manufacturing overhead of 200,000 total. And I'm dividing that by the number of units that I produced to get fixed manufacturing overhead of $20 per unit. So I have full manufacturing overhead per unit of $65. Where is that going to show up? That's going to equal my cost of goods sold, right? But now I have to ask myself, right? And this is going to be for my full absorption. What are my variable costs per unit? So variable cost per unit. Well, my variable cost per unit is going to be my DM plus my DL plus my OH, which equals my 45, right? What else is it going to be? It's going to be plus an additional $5 here. Because let me see here. I have my 45 plus my 5. Oh, duh, you guys, come on, help me out. My 5 per unit sold. So I am looking at my non-manufacturing cost here, and I'm saying, well, yeah, that is my variable cost, okay? Even though it's not a manufacturing cost, it's still considered a variable cost. So I'm flowing that up here, right? Even though it's a non-manufacturing cost. So when we come in and prepare a method or our income statement between the two methods, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. We start with sales, and those are always going to be the same. Those equal each other, right? But now my cost of goods sold, we calculated, is my 65 under my full absorption costing. So I have my 8,000 times 65. So I have cost of goods sold of $520,000 to get gross margin. And now I have less my selling expenses and my general and administrative expenses. So I have my fixed general and administrative of 60 that I'm flowing through. And it tells me I have variable selling expenses of 5 times the 8,000 units that I produce. So I get my total operating income of $180,000, right? Now compare that over here to my variable costing. And over here in my variable costing, well, what am I looking at? I have the same sales, we determined that. And then I have my $50 variable cost per unit. Okay, so that is coming from different pieces, both manufacturing and non-manufacturing cost. Multiplying that by the units that I sell, I get a contribution margin of $400,000. Now I have less my manufacturing cost. Notice in my manufacturing cost, it told me that I had fixed manufacturing cost of $200,000. So I pulled through my total manufacturing, my fixed manufacturing cost of $200,000, right? That difference is what is causing the difference here. Why did I flow through the whole thing? Oopsie, sorry here. I pulled through the whole thing here. I didn't allocate it based on the number of units that I sold, okay? And that's because that's just how we treat this under variable costing. I don't allocate that out based on the units that I sold, like what I did over in here where I captured that in my manufacturing cost. I subtract out my fixed general and administrative, and I get my net operating income of $140,000. And again, what is causing this difference? Well, it's caused, the difference is caused by my inventory, right? Because over in variable costing, right, I recognize that full manufacturing. I take that 10,000, I don't allocate it out based on the fact that I sold my 8. That's only what I do under full absorption costing. Okay. So that's really important. And again, what drives the difference? So now I ask, what if I sold 10,000 and I produced 10,000? I sold the same amount that I produced. Well, there's going to be no difference, right? And why is there no difference? Because I'm recognizing the full, right, fixed manufacturing cost in both full absorption and under variable costing. Now, the opposite could be true. Say I sold more than I produced, right? I sold more than I produced. Well, here I'm going to have more income hanging out in my variable costing, right? Because I would have already recognized those fixed manufacturing costs in the period in which I produced it. Versus under US GAAP, I recognize it in the period in which I sell it. Okay. So what's really driving that again is just going to be the difference in my fixed manufacturing cost. So here's kind of a quick summary of the different things that we've talked about, key formulas, etc. As always, let me know if you guys have any questions. Otherwise, I will hopefully see you in the Excel video for this chapter. So I'll see you then.